Thanks very much, and good to see everybody here today. My name is Helen. I'm a professor of public service research and the director of the Public Service Research Group at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, which is in Australia. I might not sound Australian though, because I'm not. I'm from the UK originally and moved over here about 7 years ago. So I've got a couple of editorial roles, but I'll just talk about one of those journals first because the other one I edit with Janine, so she'll talk in a little bit detail about that. Um, so I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Health Organisation and Management. It's kind of a co-edited role with my colleague Suzanne Robinson, who's at Curtin University. And we've edited that for about 10 years now, and so it's quite a niche journal in some ways. It's predominantly about organisation and management, but in a healthcare context. And it was quite practice focused when we took the journal over, and we probably worked with that a little bit and tried to improve the kind of quality of that. And a couple of years ago, we got our first impact factor, and so it sits at an impact factor of about 1.3. So it's a Q2 journal. It's not a top journal, but it's rising kind of rapidly. We get generally about 370 or so paper submissions every year. Although having said that, I had a quick look earlier, and I think we've had about 210 so far this year. We've had a real increase in paper submissions as everybody's gone into lockdown and into quarantine. And we accept just under 22% of those papers. So we've got a rejection rate of about 80%. And often a lot of those rejections are because the paper doesn't sit with the journal. And so there's a really important lesson about making sure that you fit in there. I won't say a huge amount more about that journal, but what I thought I might do, and then the other editors will hopefully build on it and say how their journals differ, is just to say a bit about what happens when you submit a paper to a journal and what the different processes are, and how long you might expect to wait for those processes to be carried out. So when you submit a paper to us at JHOM, it comes to me as the chief editor, and I do check to see, have you kind of followed all the formatting things, and does it broadly seem to be in scope? Usually that takes about 2 days. If it is, I'll then pass it over to an associate editor, a handling editor, who will look and say, actually, is it up to quality, and is it clearly in scope for us to bother sending out to reviewers? So the biggest issue as an editor is getting reviewers to agree to review papers. So you don't want to burn the time and energy of reviewers if something's not within scope. So at that point, if you don't hear anything from us, generally in about 2 weeks, that's a really good sign. It means you haven't been desk rejected. So the paper hasn't been rejected without it going out to review. So if that happens, at that point, we send it out to a couple of reviewers. We tend to have 2 blind peer reviewers, so they don't know who you are. And we ask them to review within 6 to 8 weeks. Doesn't always happen that way. It can be tricky to get people to review papers sometimes and to review them in a timely way. But generally, we manage to get a first kind of response out to people within about 60 days, provided everything goes well. We have that first review process. At that point, you'll hear whether it's very rare to just get an outright accept. If you do get accepted, usually it's after a process of revision. So we'll come back to you and ask you to do some revisions if you're still in the process, or you might be rejected at that point. You have about 6 weeks to do those revisions. You don't need to take all of that, obviously. And then if it was more than minor revisions, it'll go out to review again. And most papers, when they're accepted, they go on early view within a couple of weeks. But the publishing process isn't kind of quick, and it isn't straightforward. So in a really good day, you might get a decision, and you might see an early view within sort of 3.5 months or so. On a bad day, it can be much longer. You're kind of looking into kind of 18 months or something like that. So I'll stop there, and the other editors can tell you a bit about how their processes differ.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll hand it over to Janine.
Thanks, Kayla, and thanks everybody for coming. It's evening time here in Australia, and So we're sort of at the end of our day, and I know that you're at various parts in yours, so it's great to see you. And for those of you who we might have seen at the IRSPM conference in Finland, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to do that. It's always, I don't tell my colleagues, but it's always my favourite session to go to the new researchers panel and to give feedback to the new researchers and to talk with them, and also to do the Meet the Editors panel there, because you really, I think, talking with the people who are doing some of the really cutting edge work in the field. So it's really great to be able to chat with you tonight. As Helen mentioned, we're co-editors of a journal called the Australian Journal of Public Administration. In fact, we have an unusual setup. We have 4 editors, and we rotate the editor-in-chief role at the journal. And the other thing that's unusual is that we're an all-female editorial group, which is extremely unusual in public administration and management generally. So we've been the editors of that journal for 5 years, and I would say in that time we've really changed the journal quite a lot, because I would say we sort of have modernised the journal. And one of the ways that we've done that is through really speeding up processes, through the introduction of things like early view and so on. Despite the fact that it's called the Australian Journal of Public Administration, we love getting manuscripts from all over the world. Our readership is really international. More than I also did my homework today and looked up all of our stats and so on. More than half of our readership is outside of Australia. We have an increasing number of people from around the world submitting to the journal. It's also one of the oldest journals in the field. The first issue was published in 1937. So we have an extraordinary sort of archive and back catalogue of the journal, and it means that we've also done some really interesting things where we've put together virtual issues of the journal, which have gone back through the archives to follow the big debates of the field over many decades. So I think we beat out Public Administration Review even in terms of how long we've been around for. So we are actually quite an international journal in terms of our readership, and increasingly in terms of what we publish. We follow a very similar process to Helen just set out for the other journal that she edits. We have a relatively quick median review sort of statistic. So I looked that up earlier. So by the time it goes out to review, the median is about 27 days. So we're relatively quick once we get it into review. But as Helen said, it can be really challenging sometimes to get reviewers. And sometimes that's because the topic can be unusual, or people are busy. We're all human beings and trying to do all this, and everyone's doing it, I always say, for love, not for money, reviewing. So sometimes it can be a bit tough, and I'm sure all the editors all have examples of where they might have sent it to 10 people asking them to review. So that can happen, and each one of those asks means that it drags on. But certainly editors don't have any interest in making it a slow process, and we certainly want to get the work out there as quick as we can. The other thing I'll just say about the journal, and others will be able to talk about it from their perspective, is that we have a massive sort of download rate for our journal. So I just looked at our latest statistics. We had 213,000 article downloads last year alone. That was up 35% last year. And so it's becoming increasingly important to get the work out there quickly, get it on early view, and it may not land in the so-called pages of the journal for some time. In fact, we don't have pages of the journal anymore, but I know myself as an author, I've sometimes waited 2 years for it to hit the pages, the physical pages of a journal, but people are reading that work and getting access to it really quickly, which is fantastic. So we have an acceptance rate of around 27%. That's been dropping very rapidly over the last few years, which is a good sign, I think. And as Helen said, we desk reject mainly because it's not in the scope of the journal. Sometimes because it's poor quality, but more often I think because it's way outside of the scope of the journal. And it's really difficult, I think, as an early career person trying to break into that sort of environment to not take it personally. But it's one thing I would say is that it's often about fit. It's not usually about you or the quality of the work. It's much more about trying to get your work in the right place. So I'll stop there and leave it to others.
Great, thank you so much. And now I'll hand it over to Anders.
Thank you, and hello everybody. So I'm Anders Villadsen. I'm a professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. I'm also an associate professor at JPART, the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, and I've had that role for about a year and a half by now. So JPART, of course, is the journal of the Public Management Research Association. It's a journal where our mission is to advance public administration by trying to publish the highest quality theoretical and empirical world in the field. We try to be a multidisciplinary journal, so we embrace many different types of topics, including organizational, administrative, managerial, and policy-based research. I think if you read JPART or browse through the pages, you'll see this reflected in a wide variety of research topics and approaches. So at JPART, the editor is Professor Mary Feeney from Arizona State University. And the way that the work is organized is that Mary handles around 2/3 of the manuscripts submitted to JPART, and then the remaining third is divided between 7 associate editors, where I'm one of these. So that means that when I receive a manuscript from Mary, she sends it to me anonymously, so I don't know the identity of the submitter, and the first decision is whether to desk reject or send out for review. And then the associate editors, if a manuscript is sent out for review, recommends a set of reviewers and basically handles the comments from the reviewers and communication with the authors. The decisions are made in collaboration with Mary. So that is the way that we have organized the editorial process at JPART right now. In terms of statistics, we received around 500 manuscripts last year, and we are also looking at numbers to increase this year so far. Our acceptance rate is fairly low. It stands between 6% and 8%, so it's sort of competitive and selective. Our desk reject rate is around 50%, meaning that 50% of the manuscripts that we receive are not sent out for review. As Helen and Janine told, the main reason for desk rejections is really fit with the mission of JPART. So, for instance, at JPART is very important, and maybe we can get back to that later, that manuscripts provide a theoretical contribution to research in public administration. And that means that when we receive manuscripts that are more empirically focused or practice focused, they are likely to be desk rejected and not sent out for review. Yes, and yes, I think I'll pass the word on now. I'm happy to of course answer any questions and talk more about the processes.
Great, thank you. And then lastly, for introductions, we'll turn it over to Maria.
Hi, thanks, Kyla. I am Maria Cucinello. I am senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh Business. I am also the new researcher coordinator for IRSPM, so I'm really happy to see you all here. And thanks to Kyla for having the idea to move this panel online. So this is a great thing to have in place also online during this COVID-19 pandemic. So I am here as a field editor for the Journal of Public Policy. I took over this role last January, and I joined the senior editor Tony Bertelli from Bocconi University and Peter John from King's College London as a field editor for governance and experimental methods. So this journal applies social sciences theory and political sciences theory to important concepts of economics, policy, and political science. We usually welcome papers that are related to different disciplines, and usually we publish also papers related to environmental issues, international political economy, but also regulatory policy and European Union processes. These are some of the key topics that have been published also recently. And we have a double-blind review process, and we try to get for each paper 2 or 3 reviewers. And once the paper has been submitted, then one of the 2 editors selects a field editor to manage the manuscript, and then we select the reviewers. Usually we select 3 for reviewers, then one of these can accept or not, and then all the other, usually in a couple of weeks, if, as the other editor said, if the paper is not desk rejected, then it's under review, and the process will take usually 60 days. This is the time around which we are working, and we try to work. Usually when the papers are desk rejected, the main issue is the fit with the journal aim, the journal scope. Otherwise, we send the papers under review. Sometimes we contact also members of the board to get a closer feedback and to have a closer look at the paper if we have some specific question in relation to the methodology used or to the theoretical contribution that can be done by the paper. So this is most we do at GPP.
Fantastic. Thank you to all of you for those great introductions. That was super helpful to kind of understand the journals that you guys represent and sort of how the process works. So I have actually some follow-up questions about the fit. I think almost every one of you mentioned that fit or scope is super important to sort of that first step. So can you talk a little bit about what a good fit really would be, or maybe the flip side of that of what is outside the scope? And then as sort of a follow-up to that is what sort of advice would you have for somebody that's pretty confident about the fit to avoid the dreaded desk reject? Are there any sort of tips for making the fact that it is a fit very salient from the beginning, or sort of anything that you've seen that makes a paper stand out from the beginning? And I'm also going to drop that question in the chat because I know it's 2 parts, and just so you guys can refer back to that in case it's helpful. So we'll start off with Janine.
Thanks. I think for me, so if I think about the AJPA, which Helen and I spend a lot of our time with our colleagues looking at papers. You know, our stated aims in that are really the study and practice of public administration, public management, or public policy. And so at the very core of it, a paper has to have something to say about that. Now, for me, the sort of the ones that are really challenging, and especially to explain to authors, is they might have a really interesting paper, which is, for example, a paper about human resource management, but it just happens to have been done in the public sector. And so for me, that's a classic one where we will tend to desk reject. It can be a great paper, but I suggest that we always suggest somewhere for it to go, and it should go really to a HRM paper or an organisational behaviour sort of journal, because the paper is not in and of itself about the study of public administration or public management. It's really about the study of people management, and the site just happens to be coincidentally in that sector. So for me, that's sort of one that we start with. And then others are just, I think in terms of working out the fit, in fact, I dealt with one like this today, which if you squinted your eyes enough, it might have something to do with public policy. I couldn't really see it, but it was something that showed absolutely clearly that the authors had not even looked at what the journal publishes. So they were doing classic sort of journal shopping. They were just sending that paper anywhere, and they didn't have any understanding of the journal. So I don't expect, for example, people to cite 50 papers from the journal when it comes to us. We're not into that sort of gaming behaviour, but certainly I think you want to join a conversation. So with an archive, as I said before, that goes back to 1937, it's likely that people have had something to say in the pages of the journal about the topic that you want to speak to, and by referencing that in some way, I think it really helps to make the fit. And the other thing I would say, which is really important, and people are sort of having this very public debate in places like Twitter about its importance, is the cover letter. People think it's very passé to have a cover letter, and we don't really have letters anymore, but I think if you can provide a couple of really good paragraphs about how the paper contributes to knowledge and is a good fit with that journal, it can really help to be convincing for the people that are going to manage it. So if you've got desk reject rates like at JPART of 50%, you know, actually making the case to the editor that the piece has something to say to a debate that's going on in that journal, and signalling to them that you took the time to have a look at that, I think is really important. So they're sort of the main points I would make.
That's super helpful. I've been following that debate on Twitter about the cover letter, and being, you know, a new to this world, wasn't quite sure. And so I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Thank you. And Anders, I'll turn it over to
you. Yes, good question, of course. So I think, first of all, as a person who has certainly taken his share or my share of desk rejects, I know they're extremely disappointing and they can really ruin a day. But sort of in the bigger scheme of things, I don't think we should dread the desk rejects as much as might be implied here. Of course, it is in some ways helpful for the author to get that decision quickly and then be able to pursue publication in journals where there is a better fit. Certainly, this is of course a disappointing decision, but I think there is a positive angle to that decision as well. With that said, I agree with Janine that of course it's important to clearly signal your fit with the journal. So this is not something that has to be stated explicitly, something that readers, first of all, editors, can easily see. So even though you think you have a brilliant piece of research and the fit and the excellence of the paper should be obvious to everyone, be careful not to assume too much here. So a cover letter is a good place to be explicit about the contribution or the fit, and really this should also be visible within the first few pages of the paper. So for JPART, we're interested in research that makes theoretical advances, and of course, what a theoretical advance is a long discussion, and something that of course there would be many ways of trying to accomplish, but showing how you aim for some kind of theoretical advance should be made very explicit. So saying that, we see quite a few papers stating that there is an important gap because we have never studied X, or we have never studied how X is related to Y. Well, that might be true, but stating that there is a gap is typically not enough. You should take one step more and also state, why is that gap important? How does it help research to address this gap? Again, don't assume that the importance of a gap will be easily or that others will see this importance as much as you do. Be very attentive to showing that explicitly.
Great, thank you. Maria?
So I agree with what Janine and Anders said. So in terms of we look, first of all, is in terms of public policy and also the theoretical contribution that the paper made. So if the paper has a lack of it's just a framework application, or it's just a case in a specific context, what we would like to see is how this can enhance the theoretical part, and so give a theoretical contribution. Sometimes it's also based in a specific context, and what we would like to see it could not be the case for a desk rejection, but for some major revision is how the paper can speak to a broader public policy community. So what we can learn from that, from an advancement in theory, but also in order to speak to broader cases. So these are the main things we'll look at the starting point, and then also how the methodology, if it is rigorous, done, and then we identify specific reviewers that will take a deeper look at the methods and then at the theory part.
Awesome, thank you for that. And then Helen.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything that everybody's said so far. I would just, so I'll probably say it just in slightly different words, but I think whenever you're writing, whether you're writing for a journal, or you're writing for a blog, or you're writing for a newspaper, or, you know, you're always writing for an audience, and that's what you need to think about. And I think Janine used this phrase saying, you know, when you write for a journal, you're joining the conversation that's happened within the pages there. And so you need to think about how you situate it within that context and how you're adding to that knowledge base. So you really need to think about your audience, and that is the biggest thing that I reject for in JHOM is, again, it'll be a clinical kind of study because we've got health in the name, but it won't talk about organisation and management, or it'll be a case study that's in health but doesn't necessarily contribute to that sort of literature. And there's, you know, a surefire way to tick an editor off is to send a journal article that it doesn't follow any of the guidelines for the journal at all. It's referenced wrongly, it's formatted wrongly, and it's out of scope. Because that just says to us, you haven't really done your homework and you haven't thought about your audience. So, you know, it seems tedious to do on top of all that additional work that you have to do to a paper, but you need to think about this from the beginning. So I always say to kind of my early career and my PhD people is, you know, you need to think from the start when you start writing who you're writing it for. You can't just sit there and think, I'm going to write a really good paper, I'm going to make this an excellent paper. Because you're not thinking about your audience. And it might be, if you do need to write that way, it might be that you write that way to start, but then you need to do some really significant editing to that before you send it to a journal. So always think about who's your audience and who's going to read it, and why would they be interested in that? Why would they be interested in, you know, if, you know, for AJPA and JHOM, we've got kind of 20% acceptance rates, but obviously it's far lower for Anders. He's got a real issue in terms of the number of pages he can have for his journal. Why is it that he should publish your article and not one of the other 690 articles that are sent to him every year?
Great. Thank you for mentioning also the importance of writing for the audience. I've heard conflicting advice over the years about, you know, when you begin to write, think about where you would send that to and sort of frame it within that audience. But then I've thought the flip side I've also heard is, you know, just write the article, do the research, and then figure out where you're going to send it afterwards. And it's been hard to kind of think about, well, which one, because those can often be very different sort of paths to take. So that's a really interesting perspective, and something that makes me think about that question a little bit more. So thank you. Great. So I want to talk a little bit about the peer review process. Specifically, sort of how we as new researchers, emerging scholars might be able to get kind of tapped into this. I know reviewing is a huge part of what sort of just makes this whole system work in any capacity. And so, you know, and not to mention, it's just a great service, I think, to the field. And so how can we begin to think about how to be good reviewers, knowing that this is going to be important to our career and something that's really, you know, expected of us as we go into faculty positions, if that's where we end up. And, you know, what are some skills that we can begin to think about developing now? And then how do we sort of maybe throw our name in the hat to begin to get reviewer requests so that we can begin to practice this? So again, that's kind of a couple part question. I'll drop it in the chat too if you guys want to reference that before you answer. And we'll start off with Anders this time.
Thank you. So I agree with very much agree with the premise of the question. This is sort of reviewing is an important way to get socialized into a field. It's a way that you get to engage with research at early stages and also see that other people are making some of the same mistakes that you're making, that we all are making. So last year at the Public Management Research Conference, which of course it's cancelled or postponed this year, it was the reviewing was actually quite a big part of the doctoral consortium where we did, I think it was half a day, or at least some hours working on how to review, and the doctoral students who participated wrote mock reviews for a real paper and got to see the real reviews later. And I think that I've never seen anything done in that way before, but I think that was actually a very helpful thing for many students, because reviewing is not something that it is easy to observe from the outside. We know the process is there, but what does really happen? At JPART, we really focus on having developmental reviews. I think most journals nowadays would do that. So reviewing is not a matter of identifying all the mistakes in the paper and just writing those up in a numbered list and a big fat reject in the bottom. It's a matter of trying to identify sort of the places in which we can improve a paper. Then maybe editors will decide to reject a paper or invite it for further revisions or accept the paper. That's really not the reviewer's decision. I think when I review papers, I really see this as an opportunity to look for the hidden gems, or maybe they're not hidden, but obvious in the paper, and think about ways in which an author can bring that forward even more. At the same time, I think it's important that reviewers are conscious that authors are really the authors of a paper. So I don't think it's reviewers' role to take over a paper or ask authors to completely change what they're doing. That would be a new paper. And two final things here. So how to get involved in reviewing. So depending on the field, there might be subfields, there might be different options. So I found it very helpful to volunteer as a reviewer for the Academy of Management's public nonprofit division. Everybody can do that, and that conference actually gets a lot of great submissions. So that this will be reviewing actual papers. And then talk to journal editors, write an email to an editor, say I would like to be involved in reviewing. I think editors basically look for reviewers, so I think it would be completely appropriate to volunteer as a reviewer and get registered in the journal systems.
Great, that's very helpful. I reviewed for Academy of Management for the first time this year, and it was such an amazing system, like very transparent of how we should be structuring our reviews. And then we got feedback even from some of the authors about how constructive our reviews were, which was really nice. The couple of times that I've reviewed, it seems like I just kind of, okay, here's, my thoughts, send it out into the ether. And then I don't really know what happened after that, if it was helpful or in any capacity. And so I second that suggestion as well. Thank you for that. Okay, Maria.
Yes, so first of all, the reviewing process is important. We are all scholars, we are all publishing, we want to publish our paper, so we need reviewers. So every time accepting a review is something relevant, above all during this time when it is becoming more difficult to find people available for a review. And having good reviews is important for paper scholars. So first of all, as Anders said, the review process is overall really relevant, and what the reviewers should do is not trying to identify errors, but more trying to support and stimulate the authors in a sense that will try to uncover and to explain better what is said and how this can make a contribution, or how this can be better said in the paper. So this is the main thing, and also trying not to deviate the authors from their own line, but trying to encourage them and trying to also let them envisage other key points or viewpoints that can be also taken into account. Also suggesting, for example, some other literature, even if sometimes there are reviewers that suggest too many things, but this can be something helpful at some point in the review process. So these are the main things.
Great, that's very helpful as well. Helen?
Yeah, so I mean, one is editors love this because we struggle to get reviewers often. And also the reality is, if you are a doctoral student and you review a paper in your area, you're probably more up to date with all of the literature and the issues than a lot of other people are. And so my opinion is I really enjoy it when I get doctoral students who do this, because you spend time on it and you really engage with it because it's really important to you, because usually you're working in that sort of area. So if you're interested in AJPA, JHOM, whatever, go and sign up to the databases, the same database you'd use if you were submitting, and put your keywords in there, or drop an email to the editors, and I'm fairly sure if something comes in that area, we'll send it along to you. And I think it's a really good thing to do, because reviewing papers makes you a better writer. That's the reality of it. It engages you in a community, and it also makes you a better writer, because I think you often find, with students, when you're doing a kind of, you're teaching at master's level or something, what I think is always really interesting is if you give students assignments to mark each other's work, they usually come out with pretty similar comments to the ones that you will come up with, because they're fairly standard things that you can see. And so even though you might not have reviewed before, you kind of generally know if something is right or is wrong with a paper. In terms of what makes a good review is just, you'll have an opinion on something, but justify it for us. So, if you think there's a problem with literature or the theoretical framing, or if you think there's a problem with the methodology, don't just say there's a problem with the methodology, tell us why that is. Because I can guarantee you the majority of papers that we get have completely different opinions on them. So as an editor, you usually sat with somebody who says this is the best paper I've ever seen, and somebody who says you should reject this instantly. I don't understand why you sent it to me. You should have desk rejected it. And that's the reality of most editorial decisions. So if you can tell me why you think that, and you can kind of convince me around that, then I'm more likely to give weight to your review. The worst reviews I ever get, and sadly I've had a few of these recently, I assume because people are time constrained and are stressed, is where you say accept or reject and you have a one-line response. So you don't give me any information about how you've come to that decision. That's just, I have to send it out to review to somebody else again, because you can't do much with that. So as Anders and Maria have said, I think the most important thing for being a reviewer is be kind. That doesn't mean you say accept everything, but just remember somebody's going to read your comments. The reality is, when you get your decisions from journals, they never come at the best time of the day when you're having a really nice day and everything's going really well. It usually happens in the morning and it's raining and the kids are late for school and the dog bit you on the way out and you just crashed your car, and then you get these reviews. And so that doesn't mean you have to just say really nice things to people, but think, would you like to read this review? And just the final thing I will say is I think there's peer review karma, in that if you think the majority of us have journals where articles are double blind peer reviewed, so they take 2 reviewers at least to have a look at your paper. So I think for every paper you submit to a journal, you should review at least 2 papers, because then we distribute the kind of the workload around that.
That's great advice. Thank you. And Janine?
I agree with the karma, and I think that's a really important point. I want to say a couple of things and agree with my colleagues on the things that they've said. I also find that early career researchers tend to be the best reviewers, and the reason for this, as Helen said, is that they're usually closest to having sort of the most comprehensive understanding of what's going on. They're also very careful for the most part. And so I always like inviting early career researchers to do reviews. Now, how do you get onto the review database? Send us all your email. We'll have them. We'll have you signed up today to be part of that. And so I think it's really important to express to people that you're interested to review. Just a couple of points building on what others have said. Depending on the system that people use, we can rate reviewers. So when we go to search for reviewers on a particular topic, we can see if people produce their reports in a timely way, or whether they provide reports that are useful or not. And the editors and associate and sub-editors get to rate reviewers. So that's really important. When you're doing a review, again, depending on the system that gets used, you can often have confidential comments to the editor. So you might write differently to the editor than you might to the author, and that's perfectly fine. So it's not unusual for me to get reports that say, I was really borderline whether I should reject this or give it a major revision. And so that really helps, I think, for the editors who are making that decision, because they might have another 1 or 2 reviews that are sort of clustered in a particular area. In terms of doing sort of your first reviews, which some of you will have already done some, but if you haven't, I think this is a time that you hit up your mentors to work with you. For a lot of my doctoral students or colleagues who are starting out in the review process, I've always been very happy to read the review that they've written and to give them some advice on how they might phrase things. Just last week, I'm working with an early career researcher and a colleague of mine, and she's reviewing something for a journal, and she gave him the version of the paper, and he's going through a process of doing a sort of mock review alongside of that. So he's not doing the actual review and sending it in, but we're saying, well, how do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of the paper? So we're going through that process with him. And I was really lucky as an early career researcher to engage in one of those workshops that Anders just mentioned, where we got the paper, we wrote reviews, and we saw how the paper developed over time. And even I was more lucky because the authors and the editors were there as well. So the authors told us how they responded, the editor told us how they responded as well. So I think that's really important. And then the other thing that we do at our journal, not all journals do it, is that when the reviewer reports go out to the author, they go to the reviewers as well. So you can calibrate your own review against what others are saying. And I think that's helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it sets a social norm about what's sort of an acceptable review. And it also shows that people are putting in more or less effort. The other thing is we can edit reviews. So if we get things that are offensive, which we don't think should be going to reviewers, we can take those out. And I've had to do that at various points. I'm sure others have as well. I saw in the chat, Kayla, that Paul has raised a question about at what stage you should be raising the issue of going on to editorial roles with journals, and we'll all have different views about that. certainly at the AJPA, we have several early career researchers on our editorial board. I think that's really important for lots of reasons. The first being that we should have a diversity across the field of people represented. And as Helen rightly said, early career researchers tend to be right at the cutting edge of doing that work, and they're also bringing a new generation of people into it. I think if you are repeatedly reviewing for a journal, I don't know what the magic number is, but some people think it's like 6 or 8 or 10 papers, then you should feel that you can approach people on the editorial board and ask them what the process is for appointment. Different journals have different appointment processes. I sit on Public Management Review, for example, that has a process where they invite the existing editorial board to nominate people, and then there's a vote about who gets to come on. Others, it's at the editor's discretion. Other journals, you have to be sort of approved by the society as well as by the journal editors. So all of them are different, and there's nothing wrong with asking the editors about how that process works.
Great, that's really helpful. I did have that question on my list as well, so thank you, Paula, for dropping that in the chat, and then thank you, Janine, for addressing that question as well. That's all very helpful. I know also just the limited experience that I've had reviewing, it's definitely, I think, made me a better writer, and as I'm writing, I can sort of anticipate what reviewers might say, having been one, and so being able to experience both sides, I've benefited from tremendously, just personally. So that's great that you guys had similar feedback about that. So thank you. So I have one more question. And then if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or just drop your name and I can unmute you guys and you can ask your question yourself if you'd like. But I don't see anything else that wasn't already addressed in here. So I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll kind of see where we're at if that sounds good to everybody. So I have a question about special issues. So, you know, we've seen a lot of these come out, especially around COVID-19 very recently. But then I've also seen over the years just some different symposiums on special issue topics. And so how do special issues or symposiums work? How do you sort of develop ideas? And does the review process for these special issues or sort of topic symposiums differ from the traditional review process? I think I've noticed that it seems to be a little bit more systematic in there being a specific date that you're aiming to publish by. And so does that change how this process works? And kind of then a follow-up question, if you want to address it, if we don't have time, it's fine. But, you know, would you sort of suggest that special issues are good, especially for early career researchers that have a lot of pressure to publish and publish quickly? Do these tend to be a little bit quicker, and should we maybe be a little bit more attuned to these? Again, I'll drop all of the questions in the chat since it's a lot, and then we'll start off with Maria.
Thanks, Kyla. So the process is, I think, a bit distinctive in each journal. So, for example, we receive the editor-in-chief receives the proposal from authors for a special issue. They can be members of the board or can be out of the board members. And then he discusses with the member of the board, the editorial board, so the field editors, and then also the other board members, this opportunity. Then there can be some changes or some suggestion for changes. And then if the process and the topic they have suggested and the process that should be followed is the right one, then it can be passed through and approved for special issue. Then there will be the guest editors, but of course the process for the review process is the same for all the other papers. So a peer-reviewed, double-blind, peer-reviewed process.
Great, that's super helpful. Helen?
Yeah, so similar, generally you'll do a proposal around it, say why it's important, why the journal should publish something on it, make that case, and it'll get reviewed, usually by the board and certainly the editors around that. I don't know if anybody's doing research in this area, but we'll call come out in the next couple of weeks for a special issue that we've just had approved for Public Management Review, that's looking at AI, artificial intelligence in public management. So if any of you are working in that area, please watch this space and send something to us. So Kelly, you talked about special issues being quicker in some ways, and I'm not sure that they are always, because especially issue editors, you often kind of underappreciate the time that it takes to bring these things together, and so it just depends. Sometimes they can be quicker and sometimes not. What they do give you that's quite helpful sometimes is they situate you within a community of different authors who are really in that sort of area. So what you will sometimes see is, somebody will see that there's a special issue on a topic within a journal, and they have a broad interest in it, so they'll go and have a look at that, and they might see your paper in a way that they wouldn't do if it was just individually published into a journal. So situating you alongside those people, and those people who are really prominent in your field, can be a really nice way to go. And often you're being reviewed by people who are real experts in that area, which can be a good and a bad thing depending on the type of paper that you've written. So there's good things and bad things about special issues there. In terms of how you go about suggesting them, often you see calls from journals saying we have spaces for special issues coming up in the next couple of years, and they're looking for people to come together and to put together an editorial team to suggest a special issue around that. And there are some real opportunities to get involved in editing as an early career researcher around that, if you can find a couple of people in your field who are interested in that sort of space.
Awesome, that's really helpful. I wasn't aware that you could sort of be involved in some process to suggest a special issue, so that's really helpful to know. Thank you. And then Janine.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this. One is like when should you go about suggesting a special issue and going through that process. And I think it's a really good way to understand how the full production process of an article starts from the beginning to the end. I mean, people say you should never see, how politics is done or how a sausage is made. And actually it's sort of the same with a journal, right? It's, on the one hand, it's often the case that we think a special issue can be done more rapidly, but I agree with Helen. Certainly my experience as an editor is that sometimes they really drag out. And special issues come to you in different ways. So sometimes they come as a product of a panel that might have run at a conference. There's a group of people there who say, well, there's enough of us here that we can propose a panel. We've already had the first version of the papers, and we'll submit that to the journal. And usually that sort of proposal comes to you with, here's a list of people that we expect to see come into the issue. And you think, well, that's great because they're sort of halfway there. But I've had issues like that. Helen knows a long story about this one, where the special issue editor's own paper got rejected, right? So special issues can be messy and complicated. They still have to go through the double-blind process, so there's no guarantee that any of them get through. And so that can be a real challenge to the special issue editors and to the editors more generally. Journals that have a small number of issues per year also have to balance this idea of, well, if we only have 4 issues per year, so at the Australian Journal of Public Admin we have 4 issues per year, how many do we give over to special issues? And if a special issue runs late, are we going to end up with 2 or 3 in the same year? That's really problematic. So there can be a challenge there as well. And as I said, there's no guarantee that in the end the papers get up. But it's a really good process. I think the other way is that you just come with a great idea, and the journal said start from scratch and start commissioning and attracting papers to that. So either of those work. But I think it's a really great opportunity for early career researchers because the topic is defined. The people who have proposed a special issue have already got sort of the space in the journal set aside for them if they can produce the papers. And so I'm not sure. I think probably the chance of getting into that is higher than if you just went into the main sort of process for lots of journals, but it's still not a guarantee of publication.
So helpful. I've noticed also, you know, as I've been thinking about topics and publishing, that keeping an eye out for the special issues has helped to sort of hone in like my frame of thought and sort of how to think about questions within a particular topic, and then also tap into that network of other scholars that are working on similar things. So thank you for that. And then we will end with Anders.
Just a few remarks here. So first of all, I think the first question about fit is also very important to consider if you think about submitting to a special issue. So now it's not only fit with what the journal normally publishes, you also need to think about who are the guest editors of this special issue and what type of research are they likely to want to see in the special issue. If we focus on JPAD, we don't do much in terms of special issues. So we have published some virtual issues of JPAD. So there's one out right now on COVID-19 relevant research. So this is a collection of articles that one way or the other speaks to topics related to the pandemic. And then I know maybe I can mention that tomorrow the way that JPAD has chosen to engage with the pandemic is a virtual panel that is on tomorrow, and of course we would like to see as many as possible sign up for this. We have almost 200 by now, where we have some very interesting panelists talking about COVID-19 and how it relates to public administration research. So not a special issue, but another way to sort of engage with a specific and topic that is relevant right now.
Great, thank you. And thanks for plugging the panel for tomorrow too. We're gonna finish up the second panel, second Meet the Editors panel, and then we're all gonna run over there. So we're gonna do both, it'll be great. So I thank you for all those answers, that was incredibly helpful. I see there's a question in here from Srinivas about what are the challenges you see for those publishing work from outside the Anglosphere? Do you have any advice for them to be more successful? And I can, Srinivas, if you wanted to maybe phrase your question to the panel, and if you want to unmute yourself, that might be helpful in sort of talking through your question a little bit more. Unmute. Maybe.
Hi.
Okay. Hi.
Can you repeat what you just said? Hi.
Do you want to go? Hi. Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Might be easier to sort of talk it out from like on your own.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, I mean, I'm sure there would be a few submissions every year that journals will be getting from, I mean, those outside, work from outside the typical Anglosphere countries, and some of them may not be successful, and I certainly understand that all the journal editors would actually be very happy to see more publications come in. So what do you see are the usual limitations or weaknesses in those kind of submissions, and what do you think could be done to improve the chances of publications? Because I mean, what I see is that in some ways it seems to me that the bar is higher because of the lack of familiarity that might not be the case in case of publications, say from those from the Anglosphere. So what could be done in that? I mean, if you have any thoughts on that, I really would like to hear. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And instead of going one by one, if any of you have any recommendations or suggestions for him or answers to the question, you can feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself and respond to the question in the interest of time.
Look, I mean, I don't think it's too different in some ways. I mean, as you indicated there in your question, one of the challenges is people feel the need to describe a lot about the context so that you understand every kind of single detail of that. And you don't necessarily need that. So if you need to make sure that the kind of focus of your paper, I think for all the journals that we speak for, is predominantly analytical rather than descriptive. You need to think about how you're making that contribution. But if we think about public administration structures across even the kind of Western liberal democracies, the Australian system is really different to the US system, to the UK, to the Danish system. There are details in the Italian system, there are details about them that I don't have detailed knowledge about, and I only know about them from what the author is telling me. So don't feel the need to describe your country's entire existence, democratic system, who founded the service, what their dog had for breakfast, those kinds of things. So my advice for people is the same as it is for anybody writing for the journalist. Think about what your fit is and think about what your contribution is. And actually we often really, really welcome, because there's such a bias in our publishing, in public administration and public management. It's predominantly Western, liberal democracy stuff. Actually, I'm really pleased when I see stuff that isn't from that context, because actually usually it's saying something pretty different to what we have within there. So it's very same advice it is for other people who publish within there. And actually people are usually more welcoming than I think you might imagine in terms of those contributions.
I agree. I mean, the more I can see from different parts of the world, as a journal, not just as a journal editor, but as a reader, and someone who wants to advance my own knowledge, the better. So I appreciate that in some countries, the sort of push towards publishing outside of those countries and into a bigger international environment is a relatively new thing. And so I think for any authors who are operating in that environment, it's about really getting a handle on sort of what the rules of the game are essentially in publishing. But even in a journal called the Australian Journal of Public Administration, I can tell you that we publish pieces from every corner of the world. We love receiving them, and in fact, work with authors at various points in time to encourage them, even if it's not ready. And this goes for authors from anywhere. Even if it's not ready, but there's great stuff in there, we want to see it again. So we don't send it out and get it rejected. We say, these are the things that you might work on, and we'd like to see it again because we're really interested in the topic. So I think it can be really hard to crack into that. I agree with Helen, there's extraordinary bias. We see it, unfortunately, sometimes with our reviewers as well. And so part of our job is to also, as editors, make sure that we're addressing that in the review process with assumptions about a whole range of things. I think it's really interesting to see what sometimes people will say in reviews that they would never say to people if they were sitting in a conference room with them presenting the work. And part of our job as editors is to indicate that that's really not acceptable. So lots of papers need editing. Not everybody who writes in English as a second, third, fourth, or sometimes fifth language needs to have their work edited. And it's really interesting to see how some reviewers respond to work that might be written about a particular context, assuming that people are writing in English as a second or third or fourth language. So I think part of it is really about the field itself breaking open what we think of as public administration. I think that's coming, and it's coming at us very fast. So in a good way.
Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, so I apologize we went a few minutes over, but thank you all so much. Thank you. A huge shout out to our panelists. This is amazing. I really appreciate your participation, your time. I know there's a ton going on, and so it means a lot that you guys came together to be able to offer this knowledge to all of us new researchers and young scholars. It was tremendously helpful. And thank you so much to Maria also for her help in organizing this. It's been such a pleasure to work with her on coordinating everything these last couple months, and I really appreciate her help. So thank you. So,
Kyla, if I can just say one final word is thank you, Kyla, for helping in organizing. You did the job organizing this, was great. And one final word to all the new researchers is use your network. This is a great network that you have right now. It's online. Before it was during the conferences, but you can use it. You can just ask for friendly reviews, just chat about your work, what you are doing. This is something really relevant. It's relevant at every stage in the scholarly process, but even more when you are young. So that's great. Keep going with this type of networks.
Yes, great advice. Thank you. All right, well, then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Let's all go sign up to go review for all these journals now. So thank you, everyone, for attending. I appreciate it. See you guys tomorrow for the next panel. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
for cheering, Kayla.
Thank you, Kayla.
Bye.
You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
So, bye.